Morning, everybody. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the fifth in our series of commentaries on the crisis, in which we're intending to bring insight into the way businesses are changing, the stages of that change, how we recognize these stages, and how we need to be reacting to this pandemic as HR and finance professionals. So really focusing on what signs we should be looking for and how we should be reacting and working as the crisis continues. We'll be focusing today more on the second stage of the crisis than we have previously, as many of us are now starting to think about the future, rather than simply being overwhelmed with activities in just getting things ready. We're actually now looking at what happens next, which is very exciting, I think. So for those of you who've joined us before, there's lots of new material to discuss. So I'm delighted that today I'm joined by Hayley Standen, who is the HRD of Office Shoe Group. Hayley has, to some extent, been in the eye of the storm, actually. And as a retailer and as a retail organisation, they've had to close down faster and more completely than many other businesses. And she's going to tell us about that story and her team. And also, I think there's a second aspect which we're particularly going to focus on, which is, although retail closed down completely and very quickly, it's actually reopening quicker than many of our other businesses. So Hayley's going to talk also about her activities around replanning for that relaunch and getting the business back into back going again. So that's really exciting. So welcome, Hayley. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, Tom. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me.
Great. So I'd like to thank you all for attending and acknowledge the diversity of the attendees and the different groups from which they come. So we've got business leaders and directors. Hayley's an example. We have program directors, we have team members, and we have operation team members, all of whom are joining us. So we've got perspectives and experience from a wide range of different people, which is really great. So what we're trying to do over these sessions is to draw lessons and tips for people from all of these groups. So welcome, everybody, and thank you for giving up your time. We'll be taking questions throughout the webinar, and this is our first webinar on Zoom, so I'm not sure if the question box is in the bottom right-hand side or the bottom left-hand side, but you should see a Q&A box sitting there, so please type your questions as we go. And then Hayley and I will be addressing those with Becky's support, who's going to read them out to us at the end of the call. So please put your questions in as we go. Today, we are planning to complete three things. Firstly, continue our anatomy of the crisis and identify the stages that all businesses will be going through, focusing on practical examples of businesses in the midst of this, and share their tips and experience on what we should be thinking about, and then drawing lessons from those experiences to better equip ourselves to understand the stages that we'll be passing through, what we should expect, and the best ways to act and support during those stages. So first a note, it's kind of like a health warning, which is what we're covering and what we're not covering. We're approaching this from a business psychology point of view. So it's about how the business feels and the business needs to behave, and not from an individual perspective so much. Partly that's because we're not qualified to do that exercise, and there's lots of other commentary online about personal experience and personal impact, but we're really trying to focus on what are the business stages, etc. So that's our kind of health warning at the start. And I'd like to start with a few words about Reframing Performance. Reframing Performance is an HR transformation consultancy. I founded it about 8 years ago. We've never seen anything like this, but we're still supporting our clients in kind of helping them to replan and refocus their work for the new reality. So that's kind of where we are. So to start, I'd just like to recap that this pandemic, and I think all of us now know this, is both the largest health crisis and the largest business crisis that any of us have ever seen. And so understanding the anatomy of how that's going to work is more important than ever. And all crises in business terms follow three stages. The first of those stages is a kind of chaotic which we're trying to manage with the immediate and reactive Excuse me, my cat is playing with my computer, which is why it's shaking a bit. Go away. The first stage is that chaos stage in which we're all working in highly reactively and working along that way. The second stage is replanning and reframing, and we're going to be talking more about that today. And then the third stage, the stage which none of us have reached yet, is the new reality, what the new trading conditions are going to be. And in this particular case, because of the depth of the crisis, I don't think there's a business in the world who is not planning for a very different reality from what business was previously. So in order, the first stage, the chaos stage, is characterized by a series of temporary decisions that may or may not prove to be correct, logistical corrections, which take a lot of activity to sort out. So this is getting laptops through our teams at home, getting them connectivity, getting them working, getting them used to the kind of tools we're now using. And then short-term changes to try and stabilize things and keep things going. So when we apply this to direct, if I took a couple of examples, the kind of thing which we're seeing is that organizations are having to set up large numbers of team members who may never have had to work from home before, with their connectivity, with their hardware, with their software, and teach them to behave in very different ways. And we've all been through that over the last month or so. So Hayley, I was going to ask you actually, from an office perspective, so for office, what was that stage like? What was the experience like? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it certainly felt like chaos. And still very much in flight of the chaos stage. But as I said yesterday to you about the replanning stage, but there was lots of furlough. We'd never had this in UK employment law before. So the government and the Treasury are obviously working that through. And we were being as responsive as we could to those guidelines. We weren't set up to work from home. And we do have stores in Germany, and they were slightly ahead of us. So lots of furlough, not set up to work from home, trying to keep our warehouses open so that we could still continue our e-commerce business. And we were learning very much along the way. And also people and colleagues trying to learn how to work from home. And I know you guys have shared this on your previous webinars, but working from home, homeschooling, there are just heightened challenges. It's not a normal working from home experience for many, many people who are perhaps used to working from home.
One of the things which I thought was quite notable at the time was the as you said, furlough is a new construct, new legal construct in the UK, but it took a while for us to know what it even meant.
Sure.
How did you guys? So how did you deal with that interim?
It was it was very chaotic, and of course, as this was a new thing to our country and a new process, there was also lots of updates and lots of changes being made, sometimes, multiple times a week. So for me and my team, it was about staying close to new information that came out from the government. And then as quickly as we could, trying to understand what that meant for our business and for our colleagues, and understand how we respond to that. And trying to manage and maintain our own workforce and colleagues who were also hearing that information for the first time, and trying to get a sense of understanding from people that work for us to give us 24 hours at least to try and work out what that means. Because sometimes, many businesses have different operating procedures, different people software in order to do that. And nobody was clear on how you would claim. The portal was still being built. And obviously that went live on the 20th of April. So it was very much feeling like you needed to think on your feet, think fast, and almost keep your head above the parapet so that you were up to date and up to speed with any changes in the way that it was being applied.
It's remarkable, isn't it? If I think about it, a new employment construct which none of us had heard. Well, we'd heard of it from the United States in car manufacturing and stuff like that, but it was a very specific and particular activity, and it was brand new. And collaboratively with the government, we've added that into employment law in weeks, something which I think otherwise would have taken years, if not decades.
Absolutely, and certainly I think for businesses that operate outside of the UK as well, you've got other added challenges of, Ireland, Scotland, Germany, other parts of Europe. So depending on where you operate in, there are different nuances to how those schemes work. And Ireland, for example, they don't have the furlough scheme. It's a different scheme and managed in a different way, and along with that comes different rules. So, you're also having to grapple with that as well.
In general terms, are you finding that you apply where the company is based, or is it more where the individual is based and where they're resident?
I think we've grounded with where the majority of our stores are, and for us that's in the UK. But when it comes to employment law and procedures in that way, you can't necessarily apply that to those that live and work in Ireland or anywhere else. So certainly for us, Ireland and Germany has felt very, very different. And sometimes it's trying to just consolidate and understand what those key differences are, and therefore what those processes or payments that are due to be made and how they should be made.
Yes, I mean, we've had a lot of people where obviously the furlough provision wasn't in the contracts of staff, and clearly neither international nor local staff, and that adding it in was a necessary additional step. So most people seem to have done that by modification through letters and emails. Of course, I say letters, but actually letters have not been very successful. It's been more kind of another change, which is that we're all used to all our communications being on paper with wet signature and stuff, and actually we're making substantial changes to people's employment contracts without any form of hard copy almost. And I think that's been really interesting. Did you have to modify people's contracts significantly, or did you simply do what was necessary to notify them?
Well, one of the things that we focused on, and I focused on in particular, was to first seek agreement, because ultimately you're seeking agreement with the employees to agree to be furloughed. And I think that put us in good stead. So we wrote a communication, we wrote a briefing. I tried to do that personally with as many groups of people that I could via Zoom, and many of those people I didn't personally know. And we used those communications to put into an agreement, which every colleague then acknowledged and signed and returned. And weeks later, I'm glad we did that, because there was a new guidance that said, you need to write to colleagues or to workers to acknowledge that they have been furloughed in order for you to claim for that. So that absolutely put us in good stead to ask people to get agreement and sign and return them. But I guess that's the overly processed part of me coming out in that sense.
There's other dimensions on the retail stores as well. So safety of the stock, getting the stock in the right places and out of the wrong stores must be it must require quite a lot of people thinking about it and working in different ways. Yes,
absolutely. The setup of stores and our warehouses and obviously our offices in London are set up very, very differently, and it needs everybody to really collaborate in the leadership teams to coordinate that, and then myself and my team making sure that from a legal perspective, what that means and what the art of the possible is when you're furloughing workers and potentially asking them to come back. So I think there was lots of anxiety as we entered into the lockdown. I think when we look to come out of the lockdown, those anxieties will still be there. So I think it won't necessarily be a true reversal of all of that, but there will be people feeling very anxious about coming out of lockdown and going back to work.
Mm-hmm. Well, we'll come on to that replanning section in a moment. I guess one of the good things about Office is that you aren't closed down. You still have the online sales and the portal there. And are you seeing an increase in that, or is it kind of like fairly flat over what you just did?
Online trading has been phenomenal. It's I don't know where people are wearing their shoes. And it's been very eye-opening actually to see that in times like this we didn't expect to see the spending, consumer spending that we have. I'd say it's stable, and I do wonder if there's an element of, you know, people are allowed to go out and exercise, people are allowed to go out on a daily walk, and you know, many customers like new things, and there is something to be said about retail therapy. So I don't know, you know, if that is a factor in some of our online trading, but yes, online trading has been a saving grace for us.
But that's great. So your customers are remaining loyal and still using brand, which they may well be used to as a physical brand, but they're still coming back to you, and you'll maintain that loyalty. That's really good.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I suggest that with that we move from the chaos phase, the first phase of this kind of crisis. Oh, please, we all can't wait, and start talking about and start thinking about what is the next stage of this kind of crisis, which is actually where we need to start planning for the new reality in the new market. So right now, many businesses have started to think about the return to work and what that will be like, and what those new markets will be like. It is useful to differentiate, I think, these two areas. So we've got two different activities going on. We've got what are the practical steps required to restart our businesses, to restart the activities which we were doing previously, and that's one set of planning activities which are going on. And then we've got a second set of planning activities which are more longer term planning about what are the new realities for the business and what the new market's going to look like. So if I took BA as an example, and we must have all seen the news that they announced significant redundancies yesterday. But what they're doing is they're doing two different things at the same time. They're planning the restart of the commercial flights and how that's going to work, and how they're going to practically get their planes in the right place, plus all the other equipment. But they're also planning both in people terms, but also in supply chain terms, what they need in terms of people for the new reality as they expect it to be over the next 2 or 3 years. And that's impacting, obviously, the number of people they need, but also the number of airplanes they need, and their supply chain, all the different elements which make up a complex business. So I think that's a really interesting aspect of there's this double activity going on, and I'm going to talk a bit more about that reframing for the future in a little while. But Hayley, you're actually in the midst of the planning for the restart at the moment, which is really exciting. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little about how you're approaching that, and what you're seeing and what you're using as sources, and how you're getting information to be able to do this, and all that stuff. Because I've got Office around the corner. I can't wait to see them open. So tell us more about how you're planning that.
I have to say, it feels incredibly refreshing to be able to start to think ahead and not feel like you're chasing your tail and you're constantly in the moment all of the time, which of course you experience when you're in the chaos phase. And we're very much in the early stages of the replanning phase. I think one of the things that I'm pleased I did was, as we were going through furloughing workers and, you know, adapting the way we were working from home and setting some new ground rules that were required when you're working from home. I made lots of notes. So as things were unraveling, I was making notes about how on earth do you unpick this stuff? But it stayed in my notebook. And what has happened now is that I'm able to go back to my notebook and almost take myself back there, because it feels like such a long time ago already. It certainly feels longer than 6 weeks. But take myself back to that place of some of those things that happened, where we were furloughing workers, where we were trying to get equipment to people at home, you know, grappling with people that just don't have the right setup. You know, there are some of our workers who don't have a desk, they don't have a chair at home, they just don't have that setup. You know, and we were trying to work around those things. But we started the replanning phase by brain dumping. So I did a big brainstorm on my own of all of the things that I could think of as you start to imagine reopening stores. And it's things like, do you open all of your stores all at once? And I know there are many businesses, you know, in China, and, you know, we're going to be learning from New Zealand because they're slightly ahead of us, and there are parts of Europe that are also reopening stores. So learning from them. And, you know, do you open all of them? Do you only open part of them? Are there some that you choose to close as a result of it, and not reopen? So there's lots and lots of considerations to be made. And then you have the other part, which is learning from the supermarkets. So they have continued to trade through this crisis and had to adapt day by day to the demands of customers obviously needing to shop for food and struggling to meet the demands of online shopping and deliveries, etc. So fortunately for me, I've worked for Tesco for 20 years and have a good network there. So I've been speaking to many contacts to try and get some insight into some of the things that they dealt with in the early days of continuing to trade. And I guess I've spent an amount of time making some assumptions, because we don't know everything and we won't know everything. We still don't know when we might open, but it's the art of being prepared. So I've worked on a worst case scenario. So imagining maximum social distancing measures and rules, you know, heightened hygiene. Safety is going to be so important to both staff who are looking to return to work and customers who choose to come into our footwear stores and rather than do that online. And then from the research side, I found Draper's hugely helpful. There's some great documents on there. There was the British Retail Consortium produced a pack for non-retailers that gives really good guidance on what you might want to be thinking about to reopen non-food retail stores, and particularly stores where you've got a small square footage, because social distancing, 2 meters, having a separate entry and exit points might not be that easy. And it's not just social distancing on the shop floor, it's social distancing in non-customer facing areas as well. So, but it's feeling very refreshing to start to think a little bit ahead.
It's very interesting that you, I think that the comment about the research coming from both Tesco's and places like that, I think is fascinating. I think, you know, Tesco's have been extraordinary, really, as have the other supermarkets in keeping open throughout these kind of hard times. And, you know, they may not be counted as an essential service, but, you know, certainly for those people who don't have the ability to do online shopping and stuff like that, they sure are. And they've been open all the way through. And it's fascinating. They must have learned so much about how to achieve this. But I'm also really interested in the comments about Drapers, because Drapers is for those of you guys who don't know, it's the magazine and the online magazine for retailers generally, and clothes and fashion retailers. But because I think that the planning in these stages is coming out earlier, and because that's an international magazine, I suspect that the kind of learnings which they're getting, the kind of checklists they're producing and stuff like that, are not just useful for you, Hayley, but are going to be useful to many of the rest of us. Because all this experience of the reopening in different countries, etc., we all need to consider in our own businesses, even if they may not be retail. Mm. So, yes, so that is I think that is very interesting. But presumably you're taking those kind of guidances and turning them into your own checklists, Hayley.
Yes, absolutely. So we only started really brainstorming last week, and then we've drawn in a few members of our leadership team, kind of bit by bit, to then engage with them in terms of what we've thought of so far and get their take and thoughts on that, because of course many of us have different points of view and think differently and think about different parts of the business and how things will work. So that's been really useful. But when you look at some of the materials that are readily available out there, it really does two things. It heightens your awareness to some things you might not have naturally thought of, but it also gives you some inner confidence that actually most of the stuff in there we have thought of, but there might be some new dimensions to things that you need to consider. So yes, it's been really hugely helpful, and I think Drapers and the news just generally, and learning from other countries, and also using your network of people that have had to continue to work and not be isolated at home has been fascinating, because as we've already said, there are many supermarkets and hundreds of people that are having to work in warehouses and supermarkets to try and keep all of us at home fed, watered and clothed and everything else.
And I'm also fascinated with it's brand new to me, the idea of you keeping your notes and then referring back to them. I mean, I keep notes, but I never refer back to them, but I'm going to, because I think actually now I think about it, the various conversations I had with different people during the crisis, team members, colleagues, etc., and the different things which we kind of, the subtly different commitments, the different questions they asked, which I then answered and kind of took notes of. Actually, these are really important because, and I think that's a really good tip, actually, which is keeping notes of each conversation, both when we're receiving information, but also giving information. And I think I like that idea. I'm loving the kind of model that during the crisis, you're looking outwards at other organizations who advance, etc. You're looking at the literature and the publishers who are telling the stories about those other organizations, but you're also looking inwardly at your own notes and team. And I think that's a really good tip for us all. Is there any news yet, Hayley, as to when you're expecting to be able to do limited reopening? We've all heard that B&Q reopened at the weekend and are expanding, but for the rest of the retail sector, is there any guidance yet, and what are you expecting?
Not that I've seen, not unless something's happened during us being on this webinar. I know. Obviously, I read this morning that Boris Johnson is they're having a cabinet meeting today, and he's due to lead that meeting. So I'm anticipating there may be some guidance on that. Obviously, we're in lockdown, I think, till the 7th. So I think we're just trying to be prepared for that. But we don't know. There's no clear guidance on that yet. But I did read today that Homebase are looking to have all of their stores open by the weekend. But of course, they are home improvement business, DIY, etc. So very different to obviously footwear. So I think we're just going to have to wait and see. But as much preparation, we're trying to be as prepared as we can. So at the moment we get the go ahead that non-essential businesses can open or could start considering opening, then we can start to put some of our thinking into practice.
And presumably you're preparing for a number of different scenarios of a kind of slow build up, or longer term, smaller number of stores, or, presumably that lack of guidance means you're having to model multiple potential scenarios.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's many questions. How many stores do you open? How are consumers going to respond? I think it's the art of the unknown. I know many people are desperate to, be out and about and do more than their one piece of exercise a day or their walk a day, or, many people are talking about the shopping trip being their day out. But you just don't know. And of course, with many workers furlough and some workers unpaid, and, people that are in self-employed, and it is already starting to hit people's pockets. So we really don't know how much of a demand there'll be. Of course, at the moment we've seen strong e-commerce performance. We don't know whether that will continue.
I think it's very interesting. I think another, and moving on to the topic of the kind of reframing for the future, I noticed yesterday that, for example, John Lewis are talking about possibly not opening some of their new stores. I'm not expecting you to comment on this, Hayley, because that's obviously, sensitive to each retailer. But it's very interesting that I think that some adjustments which might have been longer term are probably going to be applied. We've all heard of the pressure of retailers of the rate increases in many of our towns and cities and stuff like that. And retailers have been under a lot of pressure, I think, over recent years. So it's going to be very interesting, I think, to see how many longer term changes are precipitated actually by the crisis, and therefore how much stronger our retailers are likely to come out of this.
Absolutely, I agree with you. I think many retailers or many businesses will be reassessing their property portfolio and starting to think through or accelerating some decisions that may have already been on the table in an attempt to try and keep a strong core business and manage cash flow and all the other things that businesses are seeing. So I think we'll have to wait and see what many businesses decide to do. But I'm not surprised with the news on John Lewis.
What are you thinking about your HR service? So over the past few weeks, the service you provide your colleagues and the team members presumably is very different from what it used to be. There's, and I was wondering, have you started, or are you starting to think that some of those changes might be deployed longer term? I'm thinking about many of the HRDs I talked to might have provided a very kind of white gloved service to their managers and colleagues, which is, has had to change entirely. There's been no face-to-face contact. It's been much more of a and they've been supporting colleagues online and with different ways, etc., more self-service, etc. And I'm wondering whether that's something which you're seeing some of the elements of that new service being deployed longer term, because presumably some are better than the old ones.
Yes, I think so. We haven't really had the time yet to apply too much thinking to that at this stage. As I said, our replanning stage only started the back end of last week, so we're still very much in two lands. So we still feel in that crisis phase of anticipating what might be coming, but we're very much still spending more and more time about the future. But it's certainly on the cards to review how you then interact and what some of those services may or may not look like. And I think, you said it possibly last week or in the webinar before that about leadership and you know, people really taking ownership for some of the key decisions that they need to make. And I think when you talked about less pressure to lead from the top, we have certainly seen some of our teams really take ownership and really come forward with some great ideas that, quite frankly, you know, some of the most senior people wouldn't have necessarily thought of in granular detail. So I think one thing that I would be keen to do more of is to encourage more collaboration and welcome more people to, you know, give their ideas. Now, of course, some people do come up with some real blue sky ideas that are just not possible all of the time, or far removed from what you can realistically do. But within in every idea, there's a little gem somewhere.
Yes, yes, and I think this autonomy is really interesting. It's a really interesting feature of the crisis, that every store in the country is different. However much retailers and other organisations have tried to make them identical, they're not. Each one is different with a different situation. And we have to find ways of allowing the people on the ground to make the right modifications which fit their correct sites. And I think that's really exciting, because I think, you know, in the past, moving a display unit from here to 6 inches over there would have required approval from goodness knows how many levels, etc. Whereas, frankly, in the new situation, if that needs to be done, then the manager and the local team are just going to do it, and they're going to be right to do it. And I think that's fascinating, and I'm really interested in that. We're seeing this across industries where the bottom-up leadership is kind of coming to the fore, and really matters. And on that, I was going to move on now a little bit to what we should be thinking about as HR and finance professionals about our kind of plans for the longer term. Now, we're not there yet, as you've said, Hayley. You know, what matters if Office don't reopen their stores, and getting that right is the top priority and is all consuming. But we do need to be using our kind of notebooks and our thought processes about what that future is going to be like, because we're seeing that there are kind of three groups of impacted businesses. There's obviously the business where the taps are off. So these are businesses which are closed down, you know, particularly food retailers, restaurants and this kind of stuff, and pubs, etc., where it's completely turned off. There's no trade at all, and that's going to stay for a while. There are those which are impacted, but where the impact is delayed. So if you took financial services or sectors like this, they are looking at the crisis and thinking, oh, something's coming, but it hasn't quite impacted them yet. And there are those which in the short term are really, really busy. So organizations which are having to do completely different things, trade in different ways, but are in one way or another critical to keeping the country and the economy going. And those organizations are busier than ever. However, I think that in terms of, from an HR professional point of view, our planning and replanning, actually, the task is not dissimilar between those organizations, because we all have duties to think about what that new future is. And I think in each of those cases, that future is going to be really different. So where the taps are off, all of us are being asked to pare down our activities to essentials. Cash is short in those organizations. Capital projects, any plans we had 6 weeks ago are out of the window, and we need to reduce them and pare them down as much as possible. Where the impact is delayed, and it's coming, and I'm hearing this from financial services a lot, they're doing the same thing. All their capital spend projects are now cancelled, or delayed, or being reduced. And to some extent, I think that they're possibly pushing to an extreme and then will retrench a little bit. So in cancelling all of the activities which they were planning to do and prioritising the new essential activities, I think everything's been thrown out, but some elements of the work they were doing still needs to return. And then for those organisations which are busier than ever, this is really interesting because actually it's their capacity to do the stuff which they were planning to do pre-COVID, which has now disappeared. So if you're an organisation planning to, I don't know, revisit your performance management with your organisation, even if you're a really busy organisation and you're busier than ever, all of your team are deployed on managing the supply chain, managing the activity, delivering the frontline service, etc. And they're not really able to have any attention to these other activities. So I think that we've got a real clear priority for all of us individually to support our businesses in that kind of need to refocus our programs and activities. We've got to look at, wherever we can, also from HR, finance and back office, reducing the costs of our suppliers, moving from more expensive suppliers to cheaper and more focused. And there's a moral dimension to that as well, which is spending an awful lot of money on a luxury HR supplier, etc., is not going to be seen well in a context where colleagues are furloughed, etc. I think that there's an opportunity here, which is to take advantage of the compromises that businesses are now willing to take. So a lot of the services we were providing pre-COVID were, I mentioned that white glove service, etc. People in the business, our colleagues, are more likely to be able to compromise and use standard processes, use standard services than they were before. And we should be considering this and taking advantage of this, because where we can explain to them that actually providing that level of service or that type of service was an expensive and had a cost, and we'd rather be prioritizing it on this other area, which is more important to our business, I think we're going to be able to drive compromises and changes in working and simplification in the way we support our colleagues in a way which we have struggled with for years. I was talking to one HRD the other day, and they're still struggling with the ability to deploy self-service in their business. Now, but this is really interesting because actually their colleagues are using self-service in one way or another. By definition, almost everybody in the country are using those tools right now to communicate with their business. That transition we need to take advantage of. 6 weeks ago, those guys would have said, there's no way we could deploy simple tools and communications online with our colleagues. But I can tell you, 6 weeks ago was a different world. Now many more of their colleagues are willing to compromise and use that kind of a support. So those are my real thoughts. So all of us need to be looking at both project measures and business measures to reduce the activity and refocus it. Project measures, what I mean by that are reducing costs of suppliers, paring down activities within a project, etc. And that's one way of refocusing and making our activities more pointed. The other way is actually using business measures, which is to reduce the business requirement. So the business used to want a 6-point approval process for every thing which anyone wanted to do, any approval of a change to someone's T's and C's or something like that. We can use that now we can use the business's desire and ability to compromise and understanding to our advantage to simplify things. And we should be doing that. Interestingly, and I think, Hayley, you talked about this earlier, but most of us are not going to actually be asked to do this stuff. Most of us are not being asked to really do much at all. What we need to be thinking about is what needs to be done and then getting on with it. If we're in a position to do so. We need to be actually thinking through and examining ourselves, what are the changes which need to be brought in place, what is appropriate for the new business, what's going to work well for the new business, rather than waiting to be asked to do this. So we need to be looking at revisiting contracts, which we thought were done and dusted. We need to be thinking about changing suppliers where they are the wrong type of supplier for new pared down services. We need to be changing business requirements from the kind of the more bespoke ones, which we used to back in a different world of a couple of months ago, be quite happy to support, into simplified and more standardized ones. And we need to be taking advantage of cheaper and more standard solutions. So I'm seeing, and I think we should all be thinking about from an HR and finance perspective, how we simplify and standardize and reduce or make more appropriate and the service we're providing to our colleagues. And that's really my kind of thought process at the moment, although it's not one which is top of your list, Hayley, I know, because you're working on getting everyone back to work. How it's going to feel is, as an ongoing position, we're going to get less top-down instruction than we're used to. We're going to see this additional ability to compromise. So our business leaders, when we do talk to them, when we make suggestions which otherwise might have been unwelcome or seen as impossible to do, I think are now possible. And we're going to see a continued need to get things done now that overrides some of the style and detail. So seeing a lot of push towards changing and deploying agile methodologies immediately. So rather than one big set of activities to get to a place, actually a series of small steps which get us to the next step of 2-week sprints, etc. I think is a methodology which has been deployed across industry. So I think that's really exciting. I think from, as HR professionals, as finance professionals, our ability to do our jobs better in the new world is going to be really strong, and that's very exciting. So,
given the time, can I jump in with a couple of questions that we've got for Hayley?
Yes, I was just going to move on to questions, which is exactly right. So please.
Perfect. Becky. So I've got one from our friend Nigel, who says, Hayley, what will you do if an employee says they're too scared to come back after furlough because of the perceived health risks?
It's a really good question. Thank you. I have thought about this because it's at the forefront of my mind, as I said earlier. And I think one of the kind of 3 main priorities that I'm looking at, or we're looking at as a business, is firstly defining what the new normal is. And the new normal needs to absolutely have at the top of the list the safe way that we're going to be operating. And it's safety for customers and it's safety for staff. And I think the approach that we would absolutely look to take is to try and reassure our staff about what those safety procedures are, because the new normal will feel very, very different. The kind of way I have it in my mind is freedom of movement won't be as free as it has been, because we won't be brushing shoulders with people in the busy streets of London, etc. So for me, it's building trust with employees and with customers by communicating and taking staff through what those new safe ways of operating are. And I think that's the way that we should really be approaching it. Much like we did when we went into lockdown, is giving people reassurance of what it meant for them. So that's certainly something that we are thinking about now. The other thing, just on that, Becky, is the other thing to also think about is if non-essential businesses are able to open, will schools be open by then? And that will then pose another challenge for parents who are all working from home, majority working from home at the moment, unless of course they're a key worker. And if our schools aren't quite open yet, that's going to pose very different challenges for many, many people.
Thank you, Hayley. And then I've had another question, which is kind of similar, actually. I mean, we heard yesterday from a recruitment firm that some of the really busy organizations are borrowing people from the less busy organizations. And Chris here has said, is Hayley finding that they are reskilling staff from stores to warehouses to cope with demand?
No, we're not actually. So our warehouses are in Scotland. So that's not as easy to do. And also the other challenge is that as nice as that would be to do is we had to make some very big adjustments to how our warehouses operated to ensure that we were adhering to the 2-metre social distancing there. But what we have had to do is really use skills from some of our head office functions remotely from home to try and collaborate with warehouses and get stock moved around the business effectively. So that's been quite, but that's probably another conversation altogether.
Thank you, Hayley. I think it's time to wrap up then, T.
Great. So everyone, thank you very much for attending. I hope that was useful today. Hayley, that was fantastic. Thank you so much for taking us through some of the challenges of restarting a business. You mentioned it right at the beginning. It is so refreshing to be talking about restarting business, replanning, all that stuff, and actually being able to spend any of our time thinking about that is really exciting. So let's hope for good news later. Yes. For non-essential retailers. It'd be great to see some of you guys being able to actually open up. We're doing another series of webinars. We're continuing the webinars on the anatomy of the crisis. I'm thinking now about taking another legal update from one of our legal partners for next time. So I think there's going to be legal questions in this restart of work, of which, Nigel, your question about those who are unable or feel unable to restart work, I think could be an interesting question with that dimension too. So we're working on more Anatomy of the Crisis webinars, and they'll be going on each Thursday. Then we're also doing AI and automation for HR, one of the key tools for driving change quickly and really bringing fast and simplified changes to our services is automation. So we'll be doing one of those ongoing series. And we're also looking at reframing our program and activities and how we as HR and finance professionals reframe what we were doing to the new reality. So I'm very excited about today's webinar, and I hope you enjoyed it, and thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.